UnAPIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are UnAPIA Nevada. Concili Incorporated is Nevada's premier Democratic campaign firm, fighting for progressive issues and candidates for over a decade, and proud sponsor of Battle-Born Progress. Tonight's episode of Out in Front is brought to you by our season sponsors, Concili Inc., Nevada State Education Association, UnAPIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt, as well as our episode sponsors, Save Lives Nevada and Washoe Education Association.
Maria Teresa, the usual substitute host for Out in Front when my boss, Annette, is out. She's probably watching anyway, so hi, Annette. We didn't burn anything down for you, not yet at least. So we are going to be talking about two pretty heavy subjects today. We have two fabulous guests that are institutions of knowledge of everything, but we really wanted to get their opinions, their hot takes, as the kids say, on the 1-year anniversary of the insurrection in Washington, D.C. And what was that? Where are we going next? What is happening up in D.C. now with the accountability to hold people accountable on that? And also Senator Harry Reid, who is no longer with us. And we wanted to call this, WWHD, what would Harry do? So what would he have done if he were in the Capitol on that day? What would he do now with everything that's happening in our country? And who was he? Why is he important? So we're gonna dive right in. I want to introduce our guests because it's been a while since Out in Front, and we want to make sure folks get to know who our guests are because they are fabulous human beings that I look up to. And so I'm going to go to them to see if they can introduce themselves and tell us who they are, what they do. And I'm going to start with Steve Sebelius, reporter extraordinaire.
Yeah, I'm Steve Sebelius. I'm the politics and government editor for the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and I write a Sunday column for the paper as well.
Thank you, Steve. And that column is probably the best hot takes you'll get in Nevada news. And Dr. Michael Green, I'll probably get yelled for that.
Well, we're among friends. I'm an associate professor of history at UNLV, teach and write a lot about Nevada, so I read Steve on Sunday to figure out what I'm going to do with the next section of the history book.
Well, welcome and thank you for being on our first show of this year of our Lord 2022. I say that because I hope that gives us good karma with the powers that be. I hope nothing crazy happens. We'll see though in 2022. So I'll dive right in and just ask you both. I think we'll get to the terrorists in a little bit before we talk to them. Let's talk about Senator Harry Reid, institution. A lot of us that have been around for a long time and know how important he was, really are going to miss him. So I want to start with him to get to know him. For those folks that don't know, are just paying attention to politics or are younger than us. I can't believe there's people younger than me now, but there's a lot of people that don't know who we are losing when we are losing Senator Harry Reid and what he meant and what he did for Nevada. So, who was he? Why are we talking about him? Why is he a big deal? Why is the president coming and the former president coming? Who is this Harry Reid that everyone is talking about, and why did we name an airport after him? So, Dr. Green, you get to go first because you're the doctor among the group and the historian.
Don't ask for a prescription. So what I'd say is that Harry Reid is the most powerful Nevadan in American history. I don't think there's any doubt about this. Senate Majority Leader for 8 years, leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate for 12. And Barack Obama is coming here because I don't think we have the Affordable Care Act or the stimulus package of 2009 or much of the other stuff that Obama accomplished without Reid. I don't know that any other leader in this era would have gotten done what he got done. Now, I could be wrong about that, but a truly major figure nationally within Nevada, often seen, I think with some justification, as a political boss, the leader unquestioned of the Democratic Party, and really the builder of whatever the Democratic Party is now, or at least has accomplished, was in part because of things he did and believed.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember working on the Obama campaign, his first one, and we were basically in Team Reid's office, Team Reidville, and I remember how influential, at least here, in getting Obama elected, and then getting everything through, how that was. I think you're absolutely right, and I'm not a historian, but that's my professional opinion.
And mind you, we don't indict people for practicing history without a license.
Good. Steve, why should we care that we lost Senator Harry Reid? Why is he so important to you?
Well, I think Reid, there were two sides to Harry Reid always. And there was a side that a lot of people didn't see, a very caring, nurturing person who hired and promoted and brought along people who have now sort of spread out across the country in business, in politics, many of them women, without drawing attention to it. He never drew attention to the fact that his staff was so diverse. He never, asked for credit for that. But yet, at the same time, the diaspora of Reid people throughout the country is an incredibly accomplished group. And I've got to believe that they learned their skills from the master, Harry Reid. There was the Harry Reid that visited the NICU at UMC that he'd helped get funding for, and just couldn't be torn away because he was speaking with the parents of each individual baby that was there and talking to them, and extended his visit probably way longer than his staff would have preferred. There was that Harry Reid, and then there was the Harry Reid who was the political figure who was absolutely ruthless and had absolutely no compunction about using power to his advantage, to the advantage of the state of Nevada. He could be absolutely ruthless and petty and vicious in his politics, but he was very effective. I think no greater thing illustrates this than when he said that Mitt Romney had not paid taxes for 10 years, and he stuck to it. And he could not be moved off that point. I even asked him, well, Senator, aren't you engaging in the tactics of the blacklist by accusing someone of something and selling their reputation? And he said, no, Steve, because in the era of the blacklist, you couldn't exonerate yourself. Nothing you could say would be satisfactory to the people who were accusing you. In this case, all Romney has to do is release his taxes. Well, eventually he did, and it turned out Reid was incorrect. Romney had paid taxes in that time. And when he was confronted 2 years later, or 3 years later after the election in which he had done this, Reid simply smiled that wan little smile and said, he didn't win, did he? And that was Harry Reid's ruthless side. And a lot of people saw that. He arranged politics, not only in other people's races, but in his own race. He won his reelection in 2010 when he was probably the single most vulnerable Democrat in the entire United States of America, by arranging to run against the weakest possible candidate in the field. Some people would say that's Danny Tarkanian. No, it was Sharon Angle, who imploded and essentially ran against herself as well as Harry Reid, and won his reelection that way. Reid was just an incredible figure on that. But I think probably to the heart of your question is this: Reid did everything he did in service of Nevada. He never forgot where he came from, that little town in Searchlight. He was embarrassed about coming from Searchlight for a long time in his life, until he heard Alex Haley give a speech about ancestry and where you come from and how that shapes you. And after that, he was absolutely proud to be the man from Searchlight. During a very rare talking filibuster on the floor of the Senate, he actually read from his book, Searchlight, The Camp That Didn't Fail, which is one way to drive up book sales. But he always remembered Nevada. Even when Nevada did not remember him, he stood in the way of a reforming of the mining law of 1872 that would have had the federal government assess greater royalties on the mining industry, which a lot of people probably who are watching this right now think ought to happen, because the mining industry, once they're done extracting those minerals, they're leaving, and that revenue will never be seen again. Reid stood in the way of that. Notwithstanding that fact that the rural economy was saved by Harry Reid, those rural counties never voted for Harry Reid, not once. And yet he stood up for Nevada in everything that he did. And both on the caring side and on the ruthless side, Harry Reid always had Nevada, I think, at heart.
Yeah, I totally forgot about that moment. That was absolutely true. He really did care about the whole state. I think a lot of people probably thought just Southern Nevada, Las Vegas, because that's where his people are, but he really did look out for the whole state. I mean, he put us as one of the first in the nation for primaries. And that put our issues on the national stage too. I remember, I like that you mentioned the caring side, because it's sometimes hard to forget with people like Senator Reid that they had that humanity about them. And I say that because in high school, I went to the Advanced Technologies Academy, ATEC, back when it was still a tiny school. And they took all the kids out to come watch someone super important. They didn't tell us who it was, and it was Senator Reid. He came to talk. And they wanted him to wrap up the questions at the end. He spoke for a long time. They wanted him to wrap up the questions, his staff. He didn't. And then once he was leaving, a lot of teachers and even students, us freshmen were like, who is he? But like the seniors and like the political debate team kids were like loving it. And we're asking him questions, wanting to shake his hand. Couldn't take selfies then because we had no cell phones at that time. But they wanted to, get the Polaroid shot. And he stopped by every person and shook their hand and encouraged them he was encouraging kids to go to law school. He was encouraging kids to do what they want to do, especially because a lot of us were magnet kids that don't have resources to go to college, don't have resources to go to school. And I saw the kid from Searchlight that struggled all the way through. Now looking back, knowing about him, I was thinking as you were talking that was the kid from Searchlight that really cares about where he comes from. That was peeking through by ignoring his staff and saying, no, I'm going to shake this kid's hand and this kid's hand and this kid's hand.
It's interesting because he served part of his tenure with Richard Bryan, who was a longtime close friend. And John Ralston had one of the great lines about the two of them when he said, Dick Bryan wakes up in the morning and says, which 7 of my new constituents have I yet to shake hands with? Because Dick Bryan is the best retail politician I think we've ever seen. And Harry Reid wakes up in the morning and says, which of my enemies shall I screw today? And it's a great line. But the fact is, Nevada does not allow you not to be a retail politician. And that was an example. And Reid could do that. That wasn't his image and reputation. And yes, I saw what Steve talked about, the caring and the ruthlessness. And well, I guess we're all supposed to be complicated people. And I think Steve nailed it.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I'm just going to hop in here real quick because I've just been dying to talk to both of you about all of this stuff. So thank you for joining us tonight. One of the things that we haven't talked about yet that was a colossal win for the state of Nevada, that, you know, again, I am personally of the belief 100% of the credit of this goes toward Senator Reid, is Yucca Mountain. Right. I mean, I think that that's an undisputable win for the state that was absolutely engineered start to finish by him. That win in specific for this state.
Well,
yeah, absolutely. Reid's opposition to Yucca Mountain, I think, was probably the most important factor in Yucca Mountain not actually happening. It was. It was something that took place right around the time he was in the Congress. Ronald Reagan signed the bill designating Nevada as the repository site. And there was not much a small congressional delegation could do about it. And I think all of the other representatives of all the other nuclear power states, Nevada receives a very fractional, tiny amount of energy from nuclear power. But these other states that have nuclear plants there had many more representatives behind the push to get rid of this waste. The federal law said you had to get rid of this waste, and against that tsunami was Harry Reid. He stood there, and while he lost the original battle that Reagan signed the bill to designate Nevada as the site, he won the war. And toward the end of his life, in the last 10 years or so, we would ask him questions. Senator Reid, Yucca Mountain has been stopped, but it's still on the books. It's still the law. It could be revived by anyone, including a Republican president like Donald Trump could come along and say, let's get this licensing going again. And Reid would always poo-poo those concerns and said, no, it's a hole in the ground. There's chain link fence around it. It's dead. It's never going to happen. At one event, he said the chances of Yucca Mountain happening are the chances of you growing hair, Steve. So it's not something you ever need to worry about. And it turns out he was right. No one has yet to revive Yucca Mountain. And now it seems the policy of the country is moving towards what they call consent-based siting. It faltered for him a bit under Donald Trump, who is not a president known for valuing the concept of consent, but that's a separate issue. But under President Obama, now again under President Biden, they're searching for a place where the state leaders, the local leaders, the tribal leaders say, okay, we will accept nuclear waste. They haven't, by the way, been able to find that magical site just yet. But I think that's eventually how this problem is going to be resolved. So, but Reid was singularly responsible for that.
I was talking with someone this week who I will not name, who is not an admirer of Reid, who said that one time he sat in Reid's office and Reid's on the phone to Democratic senators saying, I am calling in any IOU I have. You have got to vote this down. And he was very impressed. And that goes to the point, there was a story at one point of Reid and John Ensign, when he was Reid's colleague, going around talking to their caucuses. Ensign got absolutely nowhere, and I don't think it's the fault of John Ensign, to be honest about it. But Reid also had that kind of weight with his colleagues, even the ones in states where it would not be an issue or be beneficial. They were not going to go against him. He was there when they needed him.
And Will, I see in the chat a question about how would Reid have handled Manchin and Sinema, which is a great thought experiment. Reid was known. I think he's a carrot and a stick guy. He was known for carrying in his coat pocket when he was whipped a card, and on this card he would have what everybody wanted or needed for their particular district, their particular state. And he would collect these things, and then he would make sure that those things got done. And that is how he became majority leader when Tom Daschle was defeated by John Thune. And I think he would have started by handling it that way. He would have started by negotiating to say, what does Joe Manchin need? What if money were no object, and of course it isn't in Washington. If there were no restrictions on what could happen, what does he need? What does Kirsten Sinema need that will help them get reelected, that will help their districts? And I think he would have tried that approach. But if that didn't work, or if they, God forbid, made a deal and went back on it, or he perceived that they were going back on it, then I think he would have used another approach. And it was very similar to when the attorney Byron Giorgio decided in 2012 that he was going to run in the Democratic primary for United States Senate, when Reid, who had painstakingly coaxed Shelley Berkeley into the race, had already decided on his candidate. Although Reid had put Byron Giorgio on the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission and had been a big supporter up until then, he considered this a betrayal, and he turned on Byron Giorgio. And suddenly Byron Giorgio found himself in very uncomfortable positions. For example, electric carts that he made. The AFL-CIO began criticizing him for parts that were made not in America, but in China. And the pressure ramped up, and it ramped up, and it got greater and greater and greater until finally Byron Giorgio surrendered and did not run in that primary against Shelley Berkeley. She very narrowly lost that race to Dean Heller, and the rest is history. But Reid, I think, would use the carrot and stick approach, mindful of his second constituency after Nevada. It was the Senate Democrats. He would want them to vote for the Build Back Better plan, but he would not want them to do anything that would jeopardize his majority. So he would have to thread that needle, and I think he would have found a way to do it.
And
I'll echo all that, and I'll say also, the idea of Reid having the card. There's an old story that Lyndon Johnson, when he was majority leader, and I think Reid is the most accomplished Senate majority leader since LBJ, that he had a little book that had a list, not of what they wanted, though that was in there, but also what he had on them. And some of it was pretty randy. I don't think Reid had to go to that level, not in this era. But I agree with Steve. There was the carrot and the stick. And there is a line in Obama's his history of the presidency, his version of his presidency, volume 1, describing the passage of the Affordable Care Act. And he just has this one little sentence: Harry was doing Harry stuff. And I said, it's the single best sentence ever written about Reid. You don't have to know much more than that. He's doing Harry stuff. And we don't necessarily want to know what all the Harry stuff is.
Yeah, don't want to know the details, just want the hot dog at the end, the sausage making. Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's what he would have done. I think that's what would Harry do. He would carrot in the stick, and then if all else fails, he would have probably punched someone. Because that reminds me that we also, forget who he was, like just as a human being. Harry Reid, the story of Harry Reid, the human being, the kid from Searchlight who like had to walk 60 miles in the desert to go to high school, was a boxer, was starting bar fights in the middle of Searchlight. He was an interesting character. So I want to ask, we know him as the lawmaker, we know what he would have done to our two favorite people in Congress to get things done. But who was he as like a human being? I know you all got awesome stories. I shared mine, but what light do you want to shed on Harry Reid, the person? I'll start with you, Steve.
Well, I think he could be a very compassionate person. There's a story of somebody in his office who was dialing numbers on Reid's call list, and she kept dialing the wrong people. And after a couple of times, Reid got frustrated and said, do you have a learning disability or something? And she did. She did have a learning disability. So cringeworthy moment. But Reid immediately said to her, you must have had to overcome so much in your life to get here to the US Senate with that learning disability. And so he immediately became compassionate and realized that he had probably said the wrong thing. So there's that side of Harry Reid. There's the side of Harry Reid who would send notes to people. I know he sent me at least one or two of these notes when they achieved some kind of recognition, if they won an award for the Press Association, something like that. He would do that. He would call sometimes just out of the blue and talk to you about different things, very, very similar to his mentor, Mike O'Callaghan, although Reid's calls thankfully wouldn't come as early in the morning as Governor O'Callaghan's calls would. He once met a friend of mine, Chuck Muth, who's a conservative activist, and a lot of you probably on this call know who he is. And they were on an airplane together, and Chuck went up and introduced himself and said, "Senator, I know we don't agree on very much, but I just wanted to shake your hand and meet you." And Reid sent him a card, sent him a note after that, and Chuck never forgot it. He told me that story not that long ago. He never forgot that, and he adopted that tactic himself of sending notes to people to thank them for various kindnesses, and even just meeting on the plane. So there was that. There was definitely that side to Harry Reid. There's also the very stubborn side of Harry Reid. I remember once the RJ was doing something called hashtags and headlines, and it was their sort of nascent attempt to do events alongside the newspaper. And so we were over, if I recall correctly, I think at the Plaza Hotel, and the dining room was packed with people at their tables, and I was on stage to interview Reid. And Reid had something he wanted to get off his chest, and so he started to talk about getting something off his chest, and he was talking about domestic terrorists. And he had a point to make on domestic terrorists, but his point was not a succinct point, and he went on for several minutes, to the point where it became obvious that he was going to talk for a while. So I tried to interrupt him in a very courtly way by asking if the gentleman would yield for a question. The gentleman did not yield for a question, and the filibuster continued for probably another 5 minutes, until such time as Reid had completed what he wanted to say, and then took all the questions and all of that. So, and that was Harry Reid. I knew instantly when he was in the middle of this that there was no stopping Harry Reid. He was not going to stop until he made his point, and it was a good point. It was a newsworthy point. It made headlines the next day. But that was Harry Reid as well.
Absolutely.
Well, on a personal level, our department has an endowed chair in his name. And I was sent to make the contact with a longtime dear friend of his, Bruce Alverson, who has a PhD in history, which he did for fun. Most people don't do this, but he did it for fun. And in the end, Reid went out and fundraised for it and was just honored by the idea there'd be a chair in his name. But when I met with him and he said, well, how much money does this involve? And I said, well, it's a couple of million. And he said, oh, no, I've raised enough money. I'm not doing that anymore. And then he goes out and he gets John Huntsman Sr. to come in with $1 million toward it, and became friendly with the woman, Susan Johnson, a wonderful historian who has the chair. And I would say in relation to that, okay, that's a more personal thing. Reid could be very funny. And it tended to go in the direction of his comment about Steve and hair. But I thought a pretty good example of this, we had a meeting related to this endowed chair in his office at the law school. And I realized that there's an old country comic named String Bean who used to say, Lord, I feel so unnecessary. I was so unnecessary. The president of the university's in there, the provost, our dean, our chair, and I'm there. And it turned out I was there so he knew there was a faculty member present who had no influence at all. And we finish, we're leaving. And his assistant leaned out and said, oh, Dr. Green, Senator Reid would like to talk with you. And I thought, okay, I'm walking out with my bosses, or I go back and talk to the retired senator. I better go back to the retired senator. So I go back, and it turns out he wants to discuss Ken Burns's documentary on country music. Why? I have no idea, but he does, and he talks about it. And at the end of it, he says, you know, I have a guitar that belonged to Joan Baez. I said, what? And he said, well, she once did a fundraiser for me. And at the end of it, she gave me her guitar. It's at the house. You'll have to come see it. And I said, well, Senator, I should warn you, as a fan, I might leave with it. And he looked over toward his security guy, looked back at me, and then jerked his head toward the guy. And he said, that's why I keep guys like him around, to take care of guys like you. And he had a great sense of humor in his own way. And I think of that where Al Franken told the story that they're walking along to the House chamber, I think, for a speech. And Franken said, talk to me so I'll look important. And Reid said, that would be impossible. Well, that's the way it went. He was an agitator, and he liked to punch. He also didn't mind if you punched him back a little bit. And I think that's something we should know about him as well.
And I think that's especially worth noting, Mike, Dr. Mike Grain, sorry, that prize fighter mentality really did play a part fundamentally for him in life. You know, again, you saw that honestly with his relationship, you know, post official role in politics with John Boehner, right? That, you know, these are literally, you know, everybody used to gauge politicians by, you know, the one that you'd want to have a beer with or whatever. But, you know, these are two guys that you could definitely see that after the working day was done, right, after the professional fighting was done, they would still, if not literally, but metaphorically, be there at the end of the bar, bruised and bloodied together, you know, kind of talking it out and still there as, you know, co-equal competitors in a business that is by nature violent and bloody and treacherous and all of that.
Well, I'll say about Boehner that he once told Reid face to face to go do something that was biologically impossible. And I think Reid appreciated that. There was a story that Claire McCaskill once told him she wasn't voting for him to be reelected as leader. She thought he was too partisan, et cetera, et cetera. He said, oh, okay. And she said, well, you're not upset? He said, well, I'd rather have your vote, but at least you told me. You were upfront about it. And it's kind of funny, too, because as Steve pointed out, Reid could be ruthless, and it would be one of those situations where you didn't know what had hit you. And only after the truck had run you over, you realized that Reid was the truck. But at the same time, you came to him a certain way, he'd come to you a certain way, and that was his attitude, I think.
Yeah, and that's actually something that I don't think we've actually talked about, is that part right there specifically, the amount of strategy and engineering, right? That wasn't by accident. It wasn't by accident that you would not have seen that truck coming, right? It was the plan all along. It happened moments after the first slight, and definitely was a byproduct not of chance, not of circumstance, not of anything, but of strategy and planning. Someplace back through here, and unfortunately you got to forgive me, we're about halfway through the show here, and somebody mentioned the second topic of the day, which was domestic terrorism. And as kind of the bridge between these two worlds, Maria, I again, as somebody who, by the way, has a pair of signed boxing gloves from this man proudly in her office, how do you think Harry would have responded to what we saw a year ago today with these domestic terrorists attempting to stage a coup?
In my mind, and before I ask the actual experts, I feel like the like musical action movie of Harry Reid that I have in my head that I've had ever since I met him, because he's an interesting person. I think he would. So an interesting fact that I don't know if a lot of people know about, but our experts probably do, but he was actually a Capitol Hill police officer, armed Capitol Hill police officer. So part of me thinks that somewhere there's a world where Harry Reid, there's an alternate universe where Harry Reid didn't retire. He was there on January 6th. And he just went back into being a police officer and just like joined, and like he's an extra person in that shot with like the guns pointing at one of the terrorists on the other side, and Harry's just one of them, just pulls out a gun out of nowhere. Who knows if that's like what he actually would have done, but I feel like it would have been in him. The rage of wanting to do that would have been in him, because he was stubborn, he was a fighter, he fought people in his youth for fun and for money. He would have gotten either so mad that either he would have like physically helped people, either like help them leave, or I think we would have seen the Harry Reid we're talking about in full display. And then I think he would have like had that list or something of like all the assholes, frankly, that helped this happen, and he would have made sure they didn't come back to Congress. Like he would have gone to canvass personally for their opponents. That's just sort of my uneducated opinion on him, my like fan fiction of Harry Reid. But Steve, what do you think? What would Harry have done if he would have been there on January 6th last year?
Well, I think like everyone else, I mean, I think they would have evacuated him from the Capitol. But I think the attitude that was shown by, say, Catherine Cortez Masto and Mike Pence, frankly, of we are not going to be intimidated. We are not going to let these domestic terrorists, and that's exactly what they are, and he would have used that phrase, stop us from fulfilling our constitutional duty. And he would have come back that very day and ensured that those electoral votes were counted, and Joe Biden's legitimate victory was sustained in the Senate. There's no doubt in my mind that he would have been equally outraged to see what happened. The Capitol breached, the Confederate battle banner, which never made it to the United States Capitol during the Civil War, finally made it to the Capitol in the hands of these domestic terrorists, all of whom either were deluded into believing some kind of lie about the election, or who willfully suspended their disbelief. I'm not sure which of those two is worse, by the way. He would not have put up with that, and nor should anyone do that. And there are a lot of people who said, well, Senator Josh Hawley had the right to object and do that. That's probably true, but I tend to think you're right, Maria. I think he would have done everything in his power to make sure that those people who knowingly encouraged those rioters, either with direct words or with their actions in objecting to an election for which there was no legitimate question and there was no legitimate objection, I think he would have made sure that they did not have the privilege of serving the United States Senate any longer.
I'll agree with Steve, and I will add that he would have been pounding this issue every day. And especially as Mitch McConnell has gone from thinking publicly saying it was a terrible thing, to being the tortoise who pulls himself back inside his shell and stays quiet, that every day Reid would start the proceedings. I think, so is my colleague from Kentucky going to acknowledge what he said after the domestic terror attack or whatever it was? And that is not a criticism of anyone now. But I think that would have been his approach. And I don't think if the White House had said, Harry, we want you to cool this, I think Harry would have had some choice words for the White House.
Yeah, that was our Harry. That was our Harry Reid. I really do think he would have been all in on calling them the T word, terrorists. He probably would have put out ads all over the country saying that, like, Hawley supports terrorists and traitors. Because I think he really took the institution seriously. We talk a lot about the funny Joker guy that had like cringe moments as a human being because he was hilarious and stubborn and a Sagittarius. So we just say what's on our minds without a filter sometimes. But he really was also a statesman that really cared about the institution. And like, he was willing to use everything to fight people, but he was one of, like, a Mike Pence, like, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to tolerate this.
Well, and Maria, he was also a scholar of the institution, right? And I think that goes hand in hand with that reverence, and that's also, I think, a huge contributor to that effectiveness as well, right? When you have that, very, very, very deep, wide, institutional knowledge of the way things work and how to get them done, you can make things happen, right? That's how you can get to the point where you have the list to do the things. And it is just absolutely fascinating, to just be here a year out, to be thinking about this, not just in that regard, but, just overall, that today is the 1-year anniversary of a violent, armed, attempted insurrection, an attempted coup against the United States to overthrow a legitimate election with no cause to question it at all, based on absolute falsehoods. It's incredible. And honestly, to me, it's a little bit shocking, to come to that realization that it's only been a year. I don't know, but then again, it also seems like it was yesterday. I don't know. I feel like we're very much still, because of the perpetuation of these big lies by people like Adam Laxalt, who continues to do this and has telegraphed his intent to do this in 2022, that we are unable to escape the gravity of this, right? Until we escape the orbit of entertaining these people who continue to perpetuate the lies, despite, again, being absolutely dog walked through the legal system. Every single time this stuff comes to a test, any real legitimate question, not like, Constitution guy 1776 on Twitter says, Like, no, but like the actual courts with real experts, not internet experts. Every single time this is tested, it gets completely demolished, completely trounced. Yet, because it's an effective strategy, these people continue to simply lie. And it's just absolutely.
Well, I am Constitution Guy 1776 on Twitter. So
I've been looking for you.
That's who it is. We knew it.
I have a bone to pick with you.
There is, though, there's a lot of rhetoric that surrounds what happened, and there are some people who think that the Democrats are making too much of it. But I know the Constitution contains a definition: somebody who levies war against the United States, who adheres to her enemies. There's a word for that, and it slips my mind. Dr. Green perhaps will remember what that word might be from his studies. And by the way, it is long past time for us to all acknowledge that Dr. Green has been.
Yeah, it's treason, it's traitorous, it's what they did.
That's the word. That's the
I knew
word.
it began with a T, Steve.
Yes,
yeah.
It rhymed with P, and that means pool. No, I'm sorry. That's the music.
So that is, you had mentioned that some people, as Fox News would say, some say, but in actuality, this was treason. It was an attempted coup. It was, like you said, they put the traitorous banner of a group of people that wanted to not be part of this country in the Capitol. So, I put this background that folks can see Voters Decide, because that was the campaign that we had to remind people that voters decide, not Trump and his followers, but voters decide elections. Voters decided Biden was going to be POTUS, and that's that. And then this happened. So that treason that happened, that really is something that we should continue to remind people of. And those people that say the Democrats and Karl Rove apparently also is on the Democrat side on this. Who knew? And like the one or two Republicans that actually believe this was not just a simple protest that got out of control, like those people forget that, like you had said, Steve, they were brought there by someone. Like, this is part of a bigger thing. This is part of a bigger, I know, so it sounds like we should put on tinfoil hats or something right now, but it's true that it's part of a bigger thing. Maybe not the Illuminati.
I'm sorry, Maria, they had a PowerPoint.
They had maps of,
I know from teaching, when you've got a PowerPoint, you're ready.
That's right. That's everybody on this, every single person on this show knows that. You got a PowerPoint, that's it. That's a plan.
Yeah, you've got a PowerPoint. You're ready to go.
It was a plan, and it was done, I think, in service to a president who simply could not bear the thought that he lost. He entertained this in rallies beforehand, saying, "Can you imagine if I lose to this guy? I'd have to leave the country. It'd be the worst candidate ever." And so his ego could not sustain this idea that he'd been rejected by these greater number of voters. He keeps saying he got more votes than any other incumbent president ever got. And he did. He got more votes than anyone ever got, except for Joe Biden, who got more votes than he did. And he could not imagine that these well-laid plans that had existed before 2016 would come to naught, because Trump had built around himself, among the Republican Party, this cult of personality. And I use that word deliberately. It is not, I think, inappropriate use of that word. It was a cult, and it had a strong leader. It had a system of belief. It isolated its followers from the outside world. They spoke to each other through their own medium and rejected the things that were believed by the larger society. It had a persecution complex. And like all cults, it ultimately ends in homicide. And that is exactly what happened on January the 6th. Donald Trump is a unique figure in American politics. He will accept praise from anyone. David Duke, the QAnon people. He would accept praise, I believe, from the devil himself, and he would reject criticism from angels because it is all about him. And what is sad is that those followers who followed him that day and who said, we are now going to go marching there to the Capitol, and I will go with you, which of course he did not do because Trump is not one to exhibit any form of physical courage, went there in the service of that cult. And even now today, having no proof for any of the things that the cult told them were true, even now today, seeing the result of this lie ending up in blood on the floor of the Capitol of the United States, even now, there are people who perpetuate this myth, either in small ways or in large ways. And it is a very dangerous thing. And for the life of me, I have interviewed many people. I have read many books about this. And I don't know exactly what the way to get people back onto the same page, to reorient them to reality. I only know this: reality is a harsh, cold mistress, and it will eventually assert itself in the most inappropriate and unexpected ways. And I just don't want people to wait until that happens to realize that they are on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of the United States, the wrong side of America.
Absolutely right. So that, speaking of reality, there's people that are starting to go to jail. That's another way of realizing that you were duped, you did the right thing. Now all of a sudden, the Blue Lives Matter are putting you in jail. Which also I find hilarious that many of these people are Blue Lives Matter people, but they actually went against the Blue Lives, trying to keep them away from committing the crimes. Anywho, that's a whole other stream. But now there comes accountability, right? The thing that a lot of them, by them I mean MAGA world and the media empire that props this up, is that the January 6th Commission is, it's part of what the Democrats harping on this too much, that it really was nothing. It was big nothing burger, as our friend Alan Stock would say. It's a nothing burger. Why do we have a whole commission around it? So can you tell us, Dr. Green, what do you think is going to happen with this January 6th Commission? What accountability do you think we are seeing? What should we see? And what is next? And I'll say before you start, if folks have questions, we have a couple of them, put them in the chat and we'll ask our panel of experts. So Dr. Green, what is the accountability we're seeing? And what does that mean for all of this in context?
Well, I have enough trouble predicting the past as a historian without predicting the future. But the question really is time. If Republicans take over the House, as many expect them to do, where does this committee go? So they really need to be watching the clock. The comparison might be Watergate, where the Judiciary Committee moved very slowly by most accounts, partly because it was and is a judiciary committee. It's a committee, that's enough of a problem. And it's lawyers, and I'm not making fun of lawyers, but they are being very scrupulous in this case about the law. And this committee, I think, will go as far as the facts take it. I have considerable confidence in them. But again, are they going to have the time? Apparently, They know this, and they are racing against the clock, and they are working hard. And if Liz Cheney is any indication, they're aiming for the top. Now, I always thought the day that I would agree with Liz Cheney was the day one of my cats would not interrupt a Zoom meeting. But of course, one already did. But there she is. And who were the only Republicans on the House floor today for the moment of silence? Liz Cheney and, heaven help us, her father. And lest we forget, her father got to be vice president during the trial run for this in 2000. So the question is also, as Steve says, about the harshness of reality. Does reality hit these people in time? I think the committee understands reality. Another point to make, we heard from Merrick Garland, and I have been joking, not entirely jokingly, that certain things wouldn't be going on if Merrick Garland were alive. But I'm also reminded of something one of my favorite bloggers, Charlie Pierce, said. He put away the Oklahoma City bombers with no leak. Nothing ever leaked out during that prosecution. He has wound the Department of Justice down tight as a drum, as it really should be. So there are things happening we just don't know about.
Yeah, absolutely. We have an actual Department of Justice now, which is hard to believe. So that leads me to, the next part of the year, which you kind of alluded to, is that there's a big election, the midterms. What is next? How is this specific moment going to be used, or is it still being used to continue stringing people along in the world of MAGA to try to reclaim power? And what does that look like? Steve, what do you think?
Well, I think, the elections are always about the future. And I think to the extent that Republicans make it a grievance about the past, they're going to lose. And I will say that there are a large and growing amount of Republicans and conservatives who reject Trump, reject the big lie, reject all of that. One of whom is Chris Christie, who has written a whole book about how to win in 2022. And one of his first points is, we've got to stop wallowing in the past. I'm a prosecutor, he says. There's no evidence for this. No one has ever shown me any evidence to prove this. And in the absence of evidence in America, the charge is unproven. And so we've got to move forward. And if we dwell in the past, we're going to lose. I still think that's very true. There are people who want to restore Donald Trump to power. And to the extent that they devote their energies to that, in the belief that he was unlawfully or improperly denied a second term, I think that's wasted energy. There are other Republicans now, though, who are salivating by looking at the economy, looking at jobs, looking at inflation, the supply chain issues, looking at Biden's missteps when it came to the withdrawal from Afghanistan, looking at the way he's handling problems such as the Soviet Russian massing of troops on the Ukrainian border, the China's military adventurism, all of these global hotspots that are going around. Biden has made some mistakes. There's no question about it. And those mistakes, I think, are going to be exploited by smart Republicans who say, listen, we've got to get back to what this party used to be, which is about small government, low taxes, less regulation, and more personal freedom. That's what the Republican Party was supposed to be about. It was not supposed to be a cult in service to a particular individual, as popular as some of those previous individuals would be. Maybe this was always there. This strain of authoritarianism was always there, and we just lucked out by having genial guys like Ronald Reagan in office, and George H.W. Bush, a man who did understand what honor and service was all about. And then our luck ran out in 2016. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. But to the extent that Republicans can exploit these mistakes and also exemplify and exaggerate the excesses of the left, I think there'll be some success. I mean, the defund the police. If I didn't know better, I would think Frank Luntz came up with that in a lab and somehow hypnotized a Democrat into creating this slogan, because it is so terrible for the Democrats. And things like that. I think you're seeing these things play out in across the country. And if Republicans can exaggerate and exploit those issues, as well as try to get back and say we are the adults in the room, they will have some success. Traditionally, the president's party loses seats. There are razor thin majorities in both the Senate and certainly in the House as well. So it could go either way. I have long stopped making predictions about what's going to happen in elections, because you never know what issues may come up. You never know what might happen. But I'm confident in saying, to the extent that people relitigate 2020 based on false premises, I think voters will reject that. I think voters have had enough of that. They've seen where that leads, and they don't want to go there again. And so I think that's my best take on it.
Yeah, and I think that I could not possibly agree with you more, that, you know, the regular folk, right, just people that don't live and breathe this stuff every single day like everybody here does, you know, the taste for all of that is gone. That all ended. People, regular folk, have soured on this, right? The mythical swing voter, if you will, you know, has been put off of this notion for now. You know, and this, by the way, you know, we talked about briefly that, you know, this didn't just start, right? Once again, you know, this is a long-term strategy. You know, again, I am, you know, by no means a particularly old hand at all of this, though I am old. But I am old enough within this to remember Tom DeLay attempting to engineer permanent majority, right? And being open and honest about that, right? And that continues out of this. And we talked about good old Turd Blossom a little minute ago. This continues through the legacy of Karl Rove and Lee Atwater, right? Like you know, this entire, you know, it is so entwined in the total war concept of political winning, right? Which, again, I am of the belief that what we saw a year ago today and what we're talking about, a violent insurrection, an attempted coup against a free and fair election in the United States based on lies, is the culmination of all of that, right? Because you don't necessarily, it's the law of unintended consequences. You make the monster, you don't necessarily get to decide where the monster goes, right? It's almost like this is a story worth telling, and somebody should write a book or something about the notion of, or concept of, you know, being very, very careful about creating giant colossal machines or leviathans, or, you know, a monster that is powered by lightning from a lab, right?
Like, you mean Dr. Frankenstein?
Frankenstein, correct. And by the way, folks, if you smash that like button right now, this entire cast will get back together to interact to reenact rather the musical numbers from Young Frankenstein. So I'm not promising, but I'm promising. Okay, so y'all just got roped into that. No, but to bring it back around again, where you end up is not a coincidence, right? In these situations, and what we saw, the attempted violent insurrection, goes all the way back through the Southern strategy, through the election of George W. Bush, and Dick Cheney, who was the first actual politician that I ever met when he burned a piece of flash paper money in front of my grade school and went on to explain wasteful government spending to me in third grade, maybe. But, again, this is not by accident, right? This is by design, this is by plan, and this is the culmination of a long-term strategy that ended, as you said, Steve, with homicide, which is where this ends up every single time, period. It ends up, it will get out of control and we will be lucky if we survive it, right? Every single time it goes, that moment from Fred Dalton Thompson in Hunt for Red October just comes back to me every single time, about the way these situations can spiral out of control when you start to play the game. When colloquially, when you F around, you inevitably find out. And it's absolute tragedy every single time.
Yep, absolutely. And you had mentioned Turd Blossom, and for the children out there that are like, what did he mean by that? Look up George W. Bush, who was a president of the United States, who gave nicknames. There's a whole Wikipedia nicknames used by George W. Bush. That was a nickname. As was Pooty Poot for Vladimir Putin, who I think is enjoying all of this that is happening, by the way. Which kind of strikes me as hilarious that, you had mentioned, Steve, Republicans being mad at Russia. They weren't mad at them when they were stealing elections for them, but that's neither here nor there. That's a whole other show after the musical that we'll do. So I want to kind of go back to Harry Reid a little bit, because we had a question on the filibuster, which, a lot of people would think, after what we saw on January 6th, and the fact that Republicans are now, some of them felt sorry or like were remorseful that night when they were like 1 year ago at about this time, you had some Republicans just like, oh, that was terrible, it shouldn't have happened, yada, yada, yada. But now we've gone back to, it wasn't a big deal, it was just a protest, it was a riot, nothing to see here. So what you would think,
Maria, can we pause for 1 second? Because you just said a thing. I would like for us to pause and stew for just one moment that the backed down, like milquetoast explanation for this is just an incredibly violent riot at the Capitol.
Just got out of hand. They just got too excited.
That's the backed down version.
Yeah. And you would think that after all of the year that we've had from just January 6th, you would think that the filibuster would be like the one thing that the Democrats are like, no, don't want it anymore. Screw you all. We need to get back on track and like actually get things done. And you help terrorists get into the Capitol. You are now backing down and not as remorseful as you should be. What do you think Harry Reid would do with all of this? Like a year later, we haven't passed Build Back Better, and we need to. We need to get people relief. You've got Republicans obstructing. You've got not just Republicans obstructing, and then you have this whole thing around the filibuster and people just begging for filibuster reform so he can get things done. What would Harry do right now?
Well, on this one, we don't have to guess because we know, because Harry Reid said toward the end of his life that we should get rid of the filibuster entirely. He was the one credited or blamed, depending on your point of view, for narrowing it down. I personally think it was a mistake. I think it was a mistake, but I will speak in defense of Harry Reid at this point. The reason he did it was he faced unprecedented opposition in the Senate. Everything was subjected to a filibuster. There were more filibusters that Reid had to deal with than anyone in his role leading up to that point. And they were filibusters on stupid things. The administration, stocking the administration with appointees who were necessary and needed to do the jobs that were there. Republicans stood in the way of that. And so Reid's action, and everybody should be clear about this, Reid's action applied to district court judges, appellate court judges, and administration appointees. So basically secretaries, undersecretaries, and all of that. He did away with the filibuster for those groups, but he specifically left it in place for the United States Supreme Court. It was Mitch McConnell who later, citing Reid's precedent, got rid of the filibuster for the Supreme Court. And that's why we have 3 more conservative justices approved under the administration of Donald Trump. I said earlier it was a mistake. I think that the filibuster exists and is very useful for the minority party, which, let's be honest, the Democrats may be very soon again. I acknowledge that the uses of the filibuster, the origins of the filibuster, are not good. They were used to stop anti-slavery legislation and to keep that abhorrent practice from being legislated out of existence. Thank God that was overcome. Took a war to do it, but we got there. I think the filibuster is very useful for the minority, and I think more people than Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema see that. And I think among Democrats, there are a lot of Democrats who are thanking them silently, very quietly whispering it, holding little toasts that are so soft that the person next to them can't hear what they're saying, because they appreciate that those guys are taking the heat for something that they too agree with. Reid had no compunction about getting rid of the filibuster because Reid had a very delightful trait, which is that he took no thought for the morrow. For the morrow shall take thought of the things of itself. If Reid could get something done today, in the next 5 minutes, he would take advantage of that, and he would leave for the next day the sufficient evil thereof. And I think when you're in a position like the Senate, you have to think more strategically than that. You have to think long term and say, today I'm in the catbird seat and I can get rid of this filibuster and pass, for example, badly needed voting reform legislation, constitutionally authorized voting reform legislation. The Review Journal editorial called it federalizing the election. No, the Constitution empowers Congress to make rules for the elections of federal officers in the United States. It's perfectly constitutional. But tomorrow and the next day and the next year and 10 years from now, when Republicans are there with bills that do the exact opposite, what are we going to do then? And we don't have the filibuster. That is a situation that I think you have to consider. And I think Reid, it's not that he didn't consider it or he didn't know about it. Of course he did. He was a master of the Senate procedures. He just didn't believe that it was a battle that needed to be fought today. And so he would get rid of it. The answer to your question is he would get rid of the filibuster entirely. They would pass Build Back Better with 51 to 50 majority, with Vice President Harris casting the tie-breaking vote. They would pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. They would pass other voter legislation, and they would worry tomorrow about what happened. But in the meantime, they would campaign on the things that they had just done in the hopes that the voters would return them to office and they wouldn't have to confront the filibuster question. What would happen when they did confront it? Well, that's something that Reid, unfortunately, is not here for us to ask him about, but I'm sure he'd have an answer.
But I think that that's a fair assessment, Steve. It's not so much a lack of tactics, right? But a tactic in and of itself, right? That he was very much a 2-problem guy, right? The problem 1 is the fight that is on your hands, and problem 2 is every single thing else from that point forward. And that list continually rotates, and that just is what it is, with some people. And again, for that will be endlessly debated, because again, the man is not here to answer the question and whatnot. But again, and I also think that that's a correct assessment, regarding the concerns of the filibuster and the complicated history of that. And again, and Dr. Green, this is something that I have specifically been waiting to ask you, and I know we're a tiny bit over time, but I've just been dying to ask you this specific question about the filibuster specifically. I remember the talking filibuster. What happened to the talking filibuster? Because that is like the I don't know if that is simply the filibuster of Hollywood mythology and the mythology of American history classes in public schools or what, but that is the filibuster, since we're talking about it, that I was taught about, right? Is that like the going to the mats, the literally going to the mats filibuster.
Well, and I'll be pedantic and say that technically what we're debating is not a filibuster, but cloture. That's the actual term for getting the 60 votes to have a vote of the Senate. And the filibuster was indeed, and there have been some classics. Huey Long did a famous one in the 30s where he spoke for 8 hours until finally nature called. The record, and my all-time favorite columnist with respect to Steve, Russell Baker, once called it the world record for pointless oratory, was Strom Thurmond for 23 hours. And apparently he would take a steam bath beforehand so that he would not have to go to the bathroom. And we had those. And if you look at the statistics, and yes, statistics can lie, but you look at the numbers, and suddenly when you've got Democrats in the White House in the 90s and then in the aughts and teens, the number of such invocations of the filibuster or cloture increase wildly. And there has been talk of reforming it by, in fact, requiring the talking filibuster. You want to have it? Get up and talk. You can grind things to a halt. Reid, Steve alluded to him reading from his book on Searchlight. He did that. Ted Cruz, I think, was off on a Dr. Seuss tangent at one point. And you do make yourself a nuisance. And it actually helps lead to action. And I will say, Reid justified his decision on the lower courts by saying, a Republican president is entitled to this too. You don't want it to happen? Don't let a Republican president get in. And of course, we see Mitch McConnell use that as a justification. I don't think Mitch McConnell needed much of a justification. He was going to find a way. All of that said, Steve's absolutely right, I think, about the other senators who would love to stand with Manchin and Sinema and cannot because of their constituencies. Manchin is sitting there saying, please, AOC, attack me. Helps me at home. Go for it. That's something Democrats need to understand and resolve. And we talked about Reid being reelected under incredible circumstances. Yeah, you adapt to and sometimes adopt certain things about your constituency.
Having served as that role for that particular election cycle on a particular campaign, I can vouch for the fact that, sometimes you need a meat shield, right? Sometimes somebody needs to be up there to take the hits and to put it in a kind of different modern terminology for the kids. Somebody's got to tank for the group, right? Somebody's got to be out there to do that stuff sometimes. And by the way, right. And I say this by the way as somebody that again, if you know me, and I'll just say it here. I am not a Mansion or Curtsy Cinema fan. I'm not big supporters of either of theirs. But again, another thing that Senator Reid understood inherently and both implicitly and explicitly was, and this ties back to that prize fighter mentality of people having roles, right? And sometimes those roles are not sunshiny and pain-free.
Yep. Tough times, crazy times, and I miss Harry Reid is basically my reaction to all of that.
The world got a little less interesting. We can agree on that. It got a little less interesting at that moment.
And we've talked for quite a while. I feel like we can go on and on. This could be an actual podcast and actually go for like a whole other hour if we could. Meanwhile, our boss is watching. I knew she was watching, even though she's supposed to be on vacation, but that's a private discussion, Annette. And we are so thankful that both of you were able to come on, because I think we were able to remember an institution who did so many things for Nevada. At the end of the day, I don't think that a lot of the organizations that exist wouldn't have been brought here by funding and like national money pouring in Nevada if it wasn't for the importance that Harry Reid fought to give the state of Nevada. And we got to talk about the terrorists, TLDR. And what would Harry do? And I really do think that this is a time where we need to be strategic. We need to be ready to get scrappy and have that prize fighter mentality. The moment, Steve, that you said, the Democrats might need the filibuster, I was like, oh my God, that's right. If it's gone, what are they gonna do if, oh Jesus, I can't. This is why I don't actually serve as an elected official, because I just panic and get into a puddle of mud. I would not know what to do, because we do have a lot of work to do, and it's a year out after a scary night, after a crazy election year, which was 2020. And we did this show because we wanted to look back, but also look forward on what the heck do we have coming next. And I hope you were all able to learn just a little bit from Steve, the two mics, and that should be the podcast that they have, Steve and the two mics. And I hope that it encourages you to actually stay involved and go out and vote this year, because midterms, I know that a lot of people say this election is like very important, one of the most important ones we've ever had. This is some important elections, one of the most important ones we've ever had. I want an election year where we're not saying that. I want an election year to be boring, where it's like, it's okay if you not go vote, but like, it's not, people won't die if you don't vote. But I hope that you are going to be going into this new year and election cycle fired up to make sure that stuff like January 6th doesn't happen again, and to uphold a legacy like of someone like Senator Reid, who would have been up there with his little book trying to make sure Build Back Better gets passed. And so that is our first OIF. I hope the boss that is currently watching thinks we did a good job. And next week we're going to hopefully we get to do a show on Build Back Better. Hopefully Senate Majority Leader Schumer gets us there. And if so, we are going to have a whole group of experts, probably some colleagues of Michael Green's from UNLV, coming on to talk about that and the impact this is going to have if it passes, if it comes to a vote. So stick around next week, 5:00. Hopefully it's on Build Back Better, and Annette will be back. So your substitute teachers, your babysitters will be gone and mommy will be back. And thanks again and have a good night. And if you have COVID tests, good for you, because there's no COVID tests out there. So get tested, get your booster if you don't already, because can't even get tests. So might as well be boosted. That's my sales pitch for the booster. Good night, everyone. And thanks again for tuning in.